As artists, one of the primary things that we're doing as we go to create great imagery, and this could be drawing comics, creating illustration, making concept art, one of the primary things that we're doing is actually creating contrast. Now, there are a variety of ways to create and define contrast within an image, within a drawing, but one of the aspects here that I think is the most important and often goes misunderstood is the difference between tonal contrast and color contrast. Now, the concept here is actually really simple. For instance, if you're trying to separate the lit and the shadow side of a form, say a particular muscle, you can do that with tone or value, which is where you make the light side lighter than the dark side. But you can actually also do that with color by making the lit side and the shadow side different colors themselves. You can often see this in play in many cartoony, stylized forms of art. Often the shadows and the light will be different colors, different hues. And this idea is also mirrored in different art movements that have been created over time. You have the concept of Impressionism, for instance, where you have something like Monet's haystacks, where the whole idea was to separate and create form, define contrast, mostly through color, mostly through just having different hues on the canvas. You could contrast that to a more tonal way of painting. Someone like Rembrandt, who was known for creating very strong light and dark contrast, your classic Italian chiaroscuro, where it felt like light was glancing off the canvas. This difference between defining contrast with color or value is, I think, one that's often misunderstood by aspiring artists and students, and I think it can lead to a lot of frustration if you're not quite sure how to get more contrast in your image. This can often be the secret to really elevating your image in the right way. So in this video, what I want to do is try and unpack this concept, and we're going to go over the basic theory, look at what it is, and then I'll show you a couple of examples from my personal work so I can show you how I was actually thinking about using these ideas in the real world. And lastly, I'll look at a few takeaways to discover how you might actually use this when you're planning your images, and I think more importantly, when your image starts to go bad and you're trying to push contrast into it, how to use this idea to do just that. Now, as usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. Think of it more like a drawing lesson or a theory lesson. It's just going to be you and me in Photoshop. We're going to look at art, talk about color theory, and hopefully through that, you'll learn how to make better images. So hopefully that sounds good. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you want to learn more about illustration or picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. This charts my journey, going from someone who, really wasn't that good at drawing or art to becoming a professional artist, being published. I discuss topics such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to think about composition, creating thumbnails for your scenes, as well as a few ideas surrounding how to think about getting professional work. It's free and the link will be in the description, so if that's something you're interested in, go check it out. All right, let's jump straight in. What am I talking about when it comes to tonal versus color contrast? This is a really simple idea, but it gets nuanced, and especially when you sort of get into the middle. So let's look at it from the most basic degree first, just so we can sort of get on the same page. Now, tonal contrast, or the contrast between light and dark, is often what we're kind of taught in the beginning. We're often taught sort of tonal rendering, and we're often taught, and I think this is where this idea becomes really interesting with the application, is we're often taught that our images need to work in black and white. This was something that certainly I was told, that you should start with a black and white rough. You should make sure your image works in black and white, because that is kind of what a successful image means. And there's truth to that. A good black and white image will survive really well. It will kind of always work. But if we look at different art movements, I think this is a good way to sort of understand it. And if you look at, the sort of style of Rembrandt and painters that were around in the same milieu, you'll see a lot of this really sort of advanced tonal contrast, the Italian chiaroscuro, where contrast within the frame on the picture plane is defined primarily with tone or value. And this means that when we take the color out of it, it still kind of works. Now, the vibrancy is decreased. So we take the color out of this one. You can see the vibrancy is decreased. Here we have an Anders Zorn with very much sort of a tonal painting here. We take the color out. It's still there. It still works. These images work in black and white because primarily, although color is aiding the contrast, primarily they are working on a tonal level. Here we've got a John Singer Sargent, which is a similar thing. Take the color out. It's pretty much the same thing. It's pretty much the same image. It's working really well. Here we have another tonal image by Sargent. Take the image out, take the color out, sorry, and you know, we're still cooking. It's still good. And this is because even though there is color contrast here, primarily what's happening is that we are working with a fairly limited palette. You know, so we're not, you know, dumping in greens and blues and purples and all these kind of different colors. You know, we're often, in many cases, these sort of tonal paintings are done with a limited palette, and it's more towards that kind of sepia tone, right? Again, these are poor reproductions, so it's important to note that often, you know, the images you're looking at, this is not like actually going to the museum and looking at a Rembrandt or a Sargent, you know, or a Monet. But, you know, it's just a 50,000 foot kind of look at this basic idea. So I do understand, you know, these are not necessarily the actual colors that would be there, but this serves as a really good example of this point. So the same thing with a Sargent, right? A lot of what is turning and creating contrast, and a lot of what we're doing when we're creating images is defining contrast. You're defining contrast between the lit and the shadow side of a form to create something dimensional, or you're actually just trying to separate one thing from another, right? So sort of my head being a certain value from the background behind me, for instance, or, you know, this person's head and this person's face, right? We sort of zoom up from the background and the thing behind them. You need to define contrast to tell that there's something there. That's how we define contrast. When you turn the lights out, there's no contrast. You can't see everything. It's pitch black, right? Simple idea. So we perceive contrast by looking at different shapes, right? We either by looking at how the light falls across a tree and creates the form, or by looking at how, you know, a berry in a tree or a piece of fruit in a tree is a different color to the tree itself, right? And this is how human perception is based. And human perception is very much based around sort of human biology. You know, not all animals and living things see the same things that we see. So we're tricking that when we do painting by defining contrast in a variety of ways. Now, Sargent is using a lot of warm and cool contrast here to elevate the feeling of contrast. So certainly when we take the color out of a lot of these images, the warm and cool contrast is not there as much. So we perceive a bit less contrast, but still it's working nicely. Now let's contrast that to, pun intended, apologies, to something like a Van Gogh, which I think works a little bit more on a color contrast level. So if we look at the difference, the contrast between the Van Gogh portrait, the self-portrait, and this Rembrandt portrait, again, we take the color out of our Rembrandt and it's still there. It's still a great rendering of a man, right? It looks very dimensional. We feel the stuff there. Now here we have a great also portrait of a man, and we take the color out, and all of a sudden, to my eyes at least, it lacks interest, contrast, drama. It lacks what made it a really nice painting, a very interesting painting. Here it has a lot of life. We can see and feel the difference between, you know, the sort of red in his eye, the red on the ear, the red on the lips, between the sort of greeny blues in the eyes, the greeny blues in some of the shadow shapes on the form. There's a lot of this sort of pointillism style contrast that you see in a lot of impressionistic work where we're using the contrast between the blue in the background, right, and these little bits of orange that are there. And this creates this feeling of color vibrancy and this aliveness, this life to the image. Similarly, if we look at Van Gogh's classic sunflowers, right, these are really interesting. And they really do talk to what sunflowers feel like, right? Yeah, if we sort of take the color out, all of a sudden it's nothing special, right? It is not an amazing painting. It's not really worthy of note, and it doesn't feel very interesting or like a sunflower. This is because primarily the contrast in this painting is defined with color. And similarly, if we use this, take the color out, right? We have we have nothings, right? These are not very interesting, but yeah, with color, they're really interesting. So yeah, that's just something that's kind of worth noting there. That that's often something that's happening. And if we sort of move over to maybe even more sort of impressionistic style of art, right here we've got really great. I'm not exactly sure who painted this one. This is just one of the ones that I'm often using to demonstrate this point. Great sort of painting of a seaside with some sort of cliffs, and we've got this great blue here. I mean, look how blue this blue is, right? If I sort of get the eyedropper out, this is a full saturation, crazy blue there, right? Again, it's a reproduction that's probably poor. I'm not sure actually how blue the original would be, but visually here, we still have an image that's working, and I've got these hyper saturated colors, right? These sort of bright reds. And yeah, they're all sort of put together. So this is where you actually do have some sort of greens, right? I've got some yellows, right? There's some actual, they're still a bit sort of muddy, these greens, but yeah, and I've got yellows, I've got reds, blues, got green in the sea, bright yellow in the sea. I mean, I'm not quite sure what color we don't have here, really. It reads really well. Let's take the color out, boom, and all of a sudden, most of that contrast disappears. Now, it's still there, it still kind of works, but it no longer feels as much as if you are sitting on a beach with all that reflected light, the sky bouncing and filling in the shadows, etc. Yeah, you can barely even see the difference between the sea and the beach. A lot of the contrast of the clouds is gone. So that just sort of tells you how much of the contrast there is created via color. And similarly, if we sort of look at some Monets, you can see that we're looking at some classic Monet haystacks, which really embody a lot of the impressionist sort of aesthetic, and it's a good way to sort of describe that. So this one works pretty well on a value level. Actually, I think we can see it's got this sort of interesting tree line, contrasted by these slightly higher in value roofs of the houses, and then we sort of got this, and it kind of still works pretty well. You can sort of read it, but it doesn't have any of the drama that I think you have when you sort of really turn on the color, and you can see these what I'm assuming are sort of flowers or something like that represented here, and you see real separation between the background now because there's color, and these are working really well. And these ones, which are again I think part of the classic sort of Monet haystack series, right? If we sort of take the color out of this, it kind of disappears entirely. It's just like a gray mess of nothing. But with it, again, it's describing something that's very unique and interesting. So that's really the difference between the tonal contrast and color contrast on a really basic level. And it's interesting that those are the sort of the two poles. Let's say we could look at tonal painting like a Rembrandt versus impressionist color-based contrast like a Monet. But you also have here some good examples of stuff that's in the middle, and this is a spectrum. It's important to understand that it's not about either or. You can use any way, shape, or form you want to define contrast, including both. But the trick is if you do too much, you often get too much, right? Often the mistakes that happen in the beginning are that people try and add a lot of value contrast, a lot of color contrast, and it's just too much, right? A lot of this is about subtlety and being clear in your communication. So here we've got a Sargent watercolor, and I'm assuming it's sort of a watercolor, at least sort of a transparent medium of some kind. And you can see this is working pretty well. If we take the color out, it still works pretty well without the color. It's not reduced in the same way that those sunflowers are or the haystacks are, but a lot of the vibrancy and the thing that really makes it interesting is lost. And this is something that, again, is working on multiple levels. The color is actually really helping to draw contrast towards the faces, right? We have this kind of real yellow vibrancy there. The color also is sort of separating just one object from another. Green backgrounds, right? Green grass. And, we have all these sort of different marks. We've got some blues, yellows or reds in here with these kind of flowers on this bush. And we're also seeing a heightened contrast between the lit and shadow side of these dress forms that is enhanced with color contrast. If we take the color out, you can see that yes, the value contrast is still there, but the color is adding a lot to the way that that sort of form reads. So, there are often images that, work well with both. And I think this is where often that sort of rule, or the idea that you should make sure your images work in black and white comes from. Because if you have good black and white tonal underpinnings, it means that as you add color, you're able to kind of plus it. But your image will kind of always have a bit of a core. But it's important to understand that with different choices here, artists are able to communicate and achieve different looks and feelings and communicate with their viewer in different ways. And that really is the key. So if we look at the sort of drama that you get, and I think you can kind of probably only get with this type of, film noir, the chiaroscuro, the black and white, the real feeling of light being in the scene and the way that we perceive the scene being through how it's lit, the shapes that are created. There's a feeling of drama there, of sort of contrast that is hard to get any other way. The feeling of form, of structure, is a lot harder to achieve with purely color, right? Because again, we really are looking at a lot of sort of the the light and dark way that we perceive the world. So there is things that can be said only with sort of tonal art, and feelings that can be achieved only with tonal art. Likewise, I think that there are feelings and things that could be said about like Monet's haystacks that are only going to be able to be expressed through the use of this color contrast and impressionism. There are feelings that you have when you're in particular parts of the world, or particular parts of day, that are only going to be able to be expressed in particular ways. And I think often impressionism and using color contrast allows us to really get feelings of being in a place at a particular time that are very hard to achieve with just sort of tonalism and just using sort of light and dark. And I think that's very important. Likewise, if you look at Van Gogh's classic Sunflowers, I think that, you're trying to communicate what a sunflower is, right? What is a sunflower? It is this sort of beautiful flower, and it has this real sort of yellow vibrance to it. And it's kind of hard to maybe describe that if you're trying to do it with a tonal sort of representation, right? Maybe you get close, but just using the color contrast here and really playing up the colors allows him to kind of communicate maybe more of the essence of what a sunflower is. Not to get too deep into art analysis, because again, I'm not really into that, but I think this is very much why it matters to us as artists, is that there are particular ways where you can communicate some things, and particular styles and ways that you make imagery will allow you to communicate the things that you really believe and see differently. And that's why I think, these are probably better representations of what a sunflower is than, many others that may be, sort of perfectly rendered. Because again, it's painting the essence of the thing, and also understanding that, often we are using contrast to define, one shape or one object from another. And color is an excellent way to do that. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of kind of why these things are different, like what the difference is between them, and why you might want to use one versus another. And likewise, Sargent, through employing a mix of both, is able to, get very strong images that work in black and white and have a sense of dimensionality and form, but are also elevated by color and sort of give that feeling of like, wow, we're outside, there's all this color, there's all this light, there's all this vibrancy, there's all this bounce light, right? We don't see a lot of harsh black shadows when you're outside like that. But, you still want contrast, you still want vibrancy, and often color is the solution there. So, as I said, hopefully this gives you a good grounding in what the difference between tonal and color contrast is at its core, and why you might want to use different methods of defining contrast in your images. Okay, so next up, what I want to do is look at and share with you some of the work that I've created, and I'm going to show you how I actually use this concept and how it kind of manifests in my work. Now, a lot of the work that I do has a big sense of color contrast, so it'd be interesting to see not just how I would use the, sort of Rembrandt versus Monet style, theory in my images. It's often not that simple, but often, even if you are working tonally, or even if you are working with a lot of color contrast, there are ways that you can look at a particular image and, depending on the scenario and what choices you have, depending on the scene or where you are or what's going on, you can either sort of dial up the tonal contrast or the color contrast depending on sort of where you are. Similar to how we saw, sort of Sargent versus Monet versus Rembrandt, using these ideas very differently. In your work, you're probably going to have a similar situation where you're kind of sitting somewhere on this spectrum and you're going to be able to use either color or tone to increase contrast depending on sort of what you want to do. So as an example, here's a concept art image that I did for a video game. And normally when I am working on a video game, unless the video game is in a really sort of intense, colorful style, I'm going to make sure that the images kind of work tonally. And this is a good example. So we've got an image where, yes, there's a sort of a color here, but it is more monotone, right? It really is dealing with that kind of yellowy, browny series of colors. And if we sort of take the color out in a similar way we did before, you can see that the image still kind of works, right? I've still got good overall shape silhouettes of the character here, this character, and I've made sure that the major sort of objects read on a value level and they're separated. And again, this is just sort of good basic image making. And it's something that, I'd always sort of try and do. It'll always tend to make an image that kind of works very well, right? But it's not the only way you can create contrast. And often what I find is when I'm creating comic books, so here's a sort of a good example, where, I just have a very simple style. So with this comic book, the Star Atlas core book that I'm sort of working on, it has a very sort of clean line French style. It's very simple. It's meant to be kind of easy to read, and it's meant to kind of feel like a comic book. I'm not trying to make it feel realistic or highly rendered, because it's actually, from a project standpoint, it's part of a video game project, and it's the story and the prequel to a video game. And the video game is an Unreal 5, fully photorealistic game. So we wanted the comic to look different, obviously be different. And because that just sort of felt like a fun thing to do and a good way to sort of differentiate them, let's say. So it's very graphic, and I lean a lot into color because I find that it sort of prints well. If we add a little bit too much value or mushiness, I tend to find that the printing becomes a little bit more challenging. So I'm often defining and looking at the scenes and trying to think about what would be a scene and what would be a way to design characters and things and scenarios that kind of work with a strong color contrast. And this is a good example. So we've got this kind of yellow holographic sort of version of the world, right? Looking at this big sort of cataclysmic event that's happened, and this sort of holographic projection of that, and they're kind of talking about it. And we've got these ships that are kind of meant to be sort of holographic, a little bit sort of, again, not necessarily transparent holographic, but, very sort of tactile. And all the characters are very simple. Now, if we, again, take the color out of this, we can see that there's still some degree to which it reads, but it doesn't have anywhere near the vibrancy that, it sort of would need to. So this is a good example of where I'm kind of cutting against that grain of your images need to work in black and white. And I'm relying mostly on color contrast to get things over the line. If you look at, for instance, the difference between the kind of minor shadow or form-based rendering here of one side of the form to another, you can see that there's a pretty big color shift, right? But not a very big, real sort of visible value shift, right? And when we sort of turn the color off, that kind of disappears, right? So there's not really any contrast between any of these elements on a value level. It's mostly happening at a color level. That's really where that is going to pop. Now the character has a little bit of a value differential to the background, but again, the primary way that there's like a real difference between the background and the character is obviously through color. And likewise, we have these sort of grays that feel very blue versus the yellows. And again, in a similar way, we've got the lit versus the shadow side of these forms, as it were. And this is a very sort of subtle color shift that's really creating most of that contrast. So again, interesting way to look at how you can use one or the other. Now, there are different, we'll see how many of these images we sort of get to, but there are some sort of different pages here that work, sorry, select this one, that work a little bit more on a tonal level. And again, you can always mix this, and a big part of this is figuring out how in your image, based on what's in your image, what colors are the things in your image, what opportunities do you have for value contrast or color contrast. And often you need to design the images to work this way. So if we look at sort of this top panel here, this is working very much on a value level, right? The color helps, right? I have this sort of really blue background, and that helps push it back. But you can see I've got foreground is sort of darker, middle ground is again in the middle, and we have this sort of background here. And a lot of these other sort of images, again, are working kind of okay on a value level. But this one, yeah, is kind of very sort of dusty, and I didn't want it to feel as if it had a lot of contrast. But the color here is really sort of giving it some extra pop, because it's literally just looking at the fact that this giant squid robot thing that has sort of been broken down is red, right, or orange. And we're comparing that against blue. Now, a big part of that is me saying, you know, I kind of, with the style, I can't have a lot of value contrast because, you know, I'm primarily in this kind of realm. But, you know, in some of these images, I can, you know, where I don't have a giant red robot, I'm going to lean into pushing the value a little bit more. Where I do have something like that, I'm going to create, you know, some color contrast. And the way I do that is, well, I know the robot is red, so a good contrast to that would be a blue, a cooler color, and I'm just going to sort of dial it up. And that's why a lot of the background is kind of blue, so that it separates from the robot. And that's just kind of artistic license. Likewise, a lot of the other characters and the things that they're wearing in these scenes are also working with that same color contrast. So it's just a good example of how you know, the color can sort of influence something that still has some value basis, but not that much. And here's another good example of that. You know, this is quite a sort of a vibrant image here, but if we take the color out, right, yeah, we're sort of not looking at the same level of contrast. Now, you could create that contrast with value, have these things in the background be a lot darker, but again, the style here is to define the contrast with color and to try and make it interesting. There are some other good examples here where, you know, I have kind of tried to lean into a bit more value contrast here though, right? This one, you know, I want it to feel a bit more as if the scene is fogged, and it's very sort of super simple image, but I've just got sort of foreground, you know, middle ground, background, character silhouetted in a doorway, very classic shot. And yeah, you know, just clean line style. There's not even any real color here. But because there's not as much color, I'm having to lean into the value contrast. And if we take the color out, you can see this image is more or less working exactly the same. So again, it's all a matter of what you need to achieve a particular result. Here's another example of an image that is, you know, existing a little bit on both. But this one I had to create much more of value contrast. So if we sort of take away the color, yeah, it's not working. It doesn't have the same sort of vibrancy, but we certainly tried to separate the character here from the middle ground and the background. And likewise, again, you know, have a pretty sort of strong shape and also have that sort of contrasted with the foreground. So again, this is often a matter of, you know, tweaking things and really sort of getting the sliders right, you know, really figuring out exactly how you're going to do this. Because obviously not in every scene you want sort of this, again, this kind of thing where we have this real strong sense of black and white. So this image is a sort of painted image. And, you know, if we sort of take the color out, it still kind of works, right? It still has that feeling, that Rembrandt-esque feeling of there being a lot of light in the scene. And you know, a lot of the value here is helping to define the form. You know, we've got bounce light, reflected light, etc. And you know, this is sort of helping us to understand what's going on. The color obviously helps to add vibrancy, but in most cases it's working in black and white. So there's just a few examples of, you know, how I would use it and the thought process behind what's going on here. So it's important to understand that this is less a matter of choosing, one thing or another and sort of maybe identifying more as like a tonal artist versus a color contrast artist. I think most of the time when you're looking at a style that you really like or a style that you really want, you are kind of sitting in a particular range of, either defining things with color or value. And often what you're trying to do is just avoid trying to push the wrong slider, right? Often the challenges here happen when you're trying to push contrast in a particular way and you're just trying to do it with value, but that's really not the best solution. Maybe color would be a better way to kind of separate things there. Or again, maybe a lot of artists aspire to create stuff that has a lot of color or a lot of tonal value, but they're often told to either, oh no, you have to have a lot of interesting color in there, or you should have a lot of tone there. Or often what happens is people look at tonal art like our Rembrandts and they think, I really like that, but they imagine there's actually more color in there. So if we go back to that and look at some of those sort of tonal images, I think often what happens is we can look at tonal imagery and we're so enamored by the feeling of light and we kind of imagine there's more color in there than there is, right? This especially often happens with sort of this limited palette. People often look at the feeling that this type of image will give them, sort of a great sort of Sargent or a Zorn, and it feels as if there's all this color in there and there's this strong level of value and rendering. And, they just imagine there's more color. So when they paint these things, they just squeeze out tubes of blue and green and purple, and it's just not there. Most of these colors here are, just sort of very limited palettes, mostly sepias, reds, etc., with a few sort of little accents to make things look a little bit more vibrant. So often, again, the challenge comes when we're just not aware of this and we're trying to get a particular result. And again, we sort of fall short. Likewise, you might sort of really be liking this particular type of art, because one of the things that happens is often we don't make a habit of going in there with an eyedropper and actually figuring out what the colors are. So if you've got education or people who are saying you got to render things, right, lit side versus the shadow side, and you need to go halfway to black to get a proper sort of separation and make things feel as if it's lit. And then you look at a Van Gogh and you're like, well, I really like this, but you try and paint it and you try and put a lot of shadows and highlights in it. And what you need to realize is mostly what's happening here is just color vibrancy and color contrast. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of kind of, how you might actually use this as an artist. How can you actually apply this? Well, I think there's two ways that are really useful to think of. Firstly is when you are planning an image. So when you're planning an image, it's good to think about what is actually in the scene, what is actually going on, what type of contrast can I use? Is the image that you're trying to create going to be very colorful? Can you put a lot of different hues in there? Is it something like the sunflowers where you want a lot of brightness? Is it a really moody scene that doesn't have a lot of color? Is it just naturally set at night where there just isn't a lot of that vibrancy? And often that will kind of give you a lot of the guidance that you need to say, okay, this is not going to be about different colors, right? This is not going to be about light versus dark, about value contrast. And I think that'll be a really sort of interesting and good way for you to start an image. It's just plan by thinking, what is the dominant form of contrast in this image? Is it a mix, right? If it's a mix, whereabouts does it fit? And where should I stay away from? Right, so I think obviously what we need to stay away from is putting all this value contrast and all this color contrast. That's often the mistake people make. Again, looking at a Rembrandt, imagining there's more colors in there, then you squeeze a bunch of fluoro pink onto your palette and you're kind of never going to be able to get that feeling of light in there, because we need contrast in all things, including contrast, because otherwise there's just too much contrast. If there's too much contrast, there's no contrast. It's all a matter of hierarchies and subtlety, being very clever in how we sort of draw the eye. And a lot of that is a matter of creating consistency. So if you just put fluoro colors everywhere and a whole bunch of value contrast, normally it's a little bit much. You need to sort of think about how these things work. But there is one last thing that I sort of want to look at there, which is that often you can deal with sort of abstraction. And a lot of good images do work by being a little bit more abstract or graphic. And this is something where I'll do some follow-up videos to this, unpack this idea a little bit more, show you some examples from different artists who are actually using these in different ways. But here's a JC Leyendecker image that I think does a really good job of showing us that, you know, it doesn't have to be one thing or another. So here we have a man who's painted in a tonal way. We've got really good rendering there, but the shadow is pitch black, right? This becomes a very graphic, design-based image. And the background is just red, right? It's just sort of flat, pure red. Now, the reason that I think this is working is because we're dealing with abstraction, with a graphic image. We're no longer really trying to look at a scene. We're sort of creating something that doesn't exist. And that's where often you can have, again, the fluoro pink mixed with a very sort of rendered image and get really interesting things happening. Often styles really work and start to come alive when people start to mix these concepts together. And that's very much worth understanding is, you know, a lot of what I'm saying in terms of consistency, like one or the other, or kind of, you know, really define a series of rules for your image, is going to apply more when you're trying to paint a scene, where we're trying to sort of look at how we understand the scene or the painting that is being created and how we kind of perceive that as being similar to reality. Often, like this Leyendecker, we're not trying to create reality, but we're still trying to draw the eye, create visual contrast, and make people interested in our image. So again, study a lot of the artists that you like and start to think about the type of images you want to make. And when you're planning your image, try and plan it with some of this in mind. The last thing that I would say is, how do you troubleshoot an image that isn't working? And I think this is where previously for me in the past, I would often be working on something and I would be having to add more contrast because, you know, it wouldn't look quite shiny and crunchy enough. And I think the thing here is always to step back and again, classify the image you're working with and sort of say, how is this working? Is it working with color contrast or with value contrast? Do you have a lot of different colors in there? Is it more or less a monotone image? Right? If there's not a lot of color in there and existing, you probably need to put a lot more value contrast in there. That's kind of the tool you're working with. Often when you are sort of dealing with something that you want to have a lot more color in, again, it's a matter of stepping back and not just adding more rendering or, you know, sort of more stuff. You know, for instance, if we go back and look at the Sergeant here, often the mistake that people would make is to say, I need to define more form in these dresses, in the drapery. And instead of kind of saying, okay, well, let's, you know, make the shadow side this kind of purpley blue and we'll add a little bit of yellow vibrancy to the light side. And that'll give us that pop and that crunch, that sort of, you know, contrast that we need to separate those forms and make it feel really sort of clear and strong. If instead I kind of went in there with a brush and just tried to make a darker version of that yellow, that's where it would start to appear muddy, right? It's not the right tool to use. So a good thing to do is just sort of look at your image and kind of say, what is the existing dominant contrast within the image and how can I work within that? Should I play with, you know, sort of making the background a complete different color, right? Like the Van Goghs here, right? You know, that might be a really good way to kind of spice up the image. Or should you try and increase the contrast between, you know, the light and the dark side of the image? Oh, sorry. Should you try and increase the contrast between the light and the dark side of the image, right? Is that going to be is that going to be the thing that really sort of makes the difference and sort of elevates the image? Understanding the difference here and being able to choose when you go from one to another, I think is the best way to really sort of troubleshoot your image. And this is something where I think you start to get a feel for this as you sort of work with your images. It's hard to sort of really describe a good way to think about saving an image without sort of having a demo and really sort of doing this. It's something I might do in the future. But yeah, I think once you start to notice this, you start to look at your image and kind of step back and see, what am I doing? Often, for instance, I would, and I'll do another video sharing some of my work so I can kind of describe a little bit of these sort of struggles that I've had in the past and how I've kind of fixed it. But yeah, I would be sitting there with an image that didn't really have a lot of color. It maybe had very bright colors, but there was just one. So if there's just one color, there's not a lot of color contrast. You just have bright one color. And it's important to understand that's essentially a tonal image. It's a monotone image, monochromatic. And what that means is that I'm much better off sort of looking at value as a good solution, right? Warm and cool of that color versus trying to sort of say, let's, add a lot of sort of vibrant color. The other thing to think of is what's the mood you want within your image? Do you want your image to feel more dramatic, like there's more interesting lighting in there? Do you want it to, feel as if, there's this sort of realistic, interesting lighting scenario going on? Or again, do you want this real sort of sense of vibrancy? And, who cares about it feeling as if there's light in there? You just want color. And the color will make it feel as if there's a lot of light in there. Because often when things are lit, they're very colorful. So it's really important to understand and break down how you actually want to use these with your art. And if an image isn't working, think about what is the dominant form of contrast and how can I work within that to plus the image to create more contrast. All right, that's all we've got time for on this particular video. As I said, I'll do some follow-up videos to kind of unpack this concept some more. If you haven't already, check out this video that talks about the difference between abstract and narrative composition. This is another really interesting aspect of picture making that I think you'll find really interesting. Other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.